Welcome to Promote, Profit, Publish. I'm your host, Juliette Clark, and today we have an editor with us and a really, really good one. I must say, I've worked with him a couple times now, and I just love the workflow, the way he handles it, the way he handles his clients. So really looking forward to telling you more about that. It's not too late to get yourself into our AI Author Academy. We had it in the month of April. It was a major hit, and the feedback we got was pretty amazing, actually. It was much better than I thought it was. People took away tools that completely changed the way that they are putting their platforms together in a much more streamlined way using a couple different tools. And one of them is quite a surprise. We actually created courses with it, outlines for courses, deep dives, advertising stuff. So there was a lot going on in the April course. You can sign up for that at AIAuthorAcademy.com. So www.AIAuthorAcademy.com. We only take about 8 people because there are so many one-on-ones with this program. So be sure and get yourself signed up. We do have a few spots left, but not very many. So love to have you be a part of that and really supercharge your author platform. And today's guest is Tyler Tichelaar, and he has a PhD in literature from Western Michigan University, and a bachelor and master's degree from Northern Michigan University. He's an editor and the owner of Superior Book Productions, and also the owner of his own publishing company, Marquette Fiction. For 12 years, Tyler has served as vice president and then president on the board of the Upper Peninsula Publishers and Authors Association. Tyler is a former guest host of Authors Access Internet Radio. He's authored 24 books ranging from historical fiction, fantasy, and nonfiction to a play and literary criticism. He lives in Marquette, Michigan, where the roar of Lake Superior, mountains of snow, and sandstone architecture inspire his writing. So it doesn't matter today whether you're a fiction author or a nonfiction author. Most of the time I've worked with Tyler on nonfiction projects, so our business books, but he's excellent at fiction too, which is really difficult to find and write, because I used to be a fiction writer. So stay tuned for Tyler. Before we get started, I want to remind you about our sponsor for this show. It is LifeWave. And if you are feeling a little bit creaky and want some holistic ways to get rid of all that, if you go to the doctor and you say, oh, I ache or I can't sleep or whatever it is, their immediate go-to is drugs. And for most of us, we don't want to deal with that anymore. So I encourage you to talk to Andy Nam about his LifeWave business. Not only can you make money with it, but I've used their products and they are amazing. You can get a hold of them at calendly.com/thefoolishcouple/superbrand. So go over there today. These are patches. You can wear them for 12 hours a day, daytime, nighttime. I prefer nighttime. But they really have changed my old creaky body into something that's livable now. All right, stay tuned for Tyler. Tyler, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Juliette. I'm thrilled to be here.
So you have been one of the really finest editors that we've worked with on projects, and usually our authors bring their editors with them. We prefer not to choose, because I know a lot of publishing companies do, but we want you to be comfortable that we don't just hand you off to somebody that's not going to respect your voice in a book. So I just want to compliment you on that, because you really have. I love the way you do things. We actually changed our structures inside of our company to match what you did with Samantha. Tell us a little bit about how you got into this. What propelled you to go this direction?
Well, I own Superior Book Productions, and that's not a publishing company, but we're a book production company. We help authors to edit their books and also do layout so they can get prepared to self-publish their books. So we just kind of assist them in that process. I've been doing that since 2009. I got started because I became an author myself. I grew up always wanting to be an author. Probably from about the time I was 9 or so, I decided I wanted to write books. And so I started writing books in high school and then sending them out, the manuscripts, trying to get published, receiving rejection letters, usually form letters, but every once in a while a nice letter that would say, we just don't think this is for us, or we just don't think this book has the right audience for our readers. I was writing lots of historical fiction and regional fiction set here in Upper Michigan. And so New York publishers didn't think it would have a broad appeal. So one day I finally got sick of all these rejection letters. And by that point, I was aware that there were other people here in Upper Michigan that were starting to self-publish their books. And so I said to myself, why should someone in New York decide if people in Upper Michigan get to read my books? It just made absolutely no sense to me. And I knew that if I published the books, I knew I was a good enough writer by that point that I would find a readership. So I decided to publish my first book. I went with one of the I guess what you'd call a subsidy publisher, one of the sort of a hybrid publishers that were popular online at the time.
Uh-huh.
It was not expensive to do, but the thing is, they would do all the layout and the printing for you. But what was expensive was I had to buy copies of my books from them, and it was not cheap to do that. And I did not have a lot of money at the time, so I could only afford to buy about 100 books at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would bring them to the local stores and try to resell them. Well, I found out stores want 40% discounts to sell your books. So for every book that I bought from this publisher and then tried to sell to the store because they want the 40% discount, I was going to lose 8 cents a copy. And I thought that does not work. I have to find more ways of doing this in a manner that I'm actually going to make some money off. I mean, I wanted to be published. It was more not so much about the money as the writing, but I wasn't going to lose 8 cents on every book I sold.
Right.
So just over time, I joined the UP Publishers and Authors Association, which was new at that point, and I learned a lot of things about self-publishing and different ways to do it and less expensive ways to do it. And eventually, I became the vice president and then the president of the UP Publishers and Authors Association. So I was the president from 2008 to 2019, actually. So quite a
Oh,
long
wow.
time, partly because it's hard to find anybody else that wants to do the job. But I think, I kept the organization going, and I found the right people to be on the board who then eventually were able to take over and succeed me. So I pride myself on that. And in the process, once I started getting my books published and people started to know who I was, I started meeting other authors. I met some publishing coaches who were very impressed that I had a PhD in literature, and they wanted somebody to edit their books. And they said, we don't know anybody that has a PhD in English, so you would be great to do editing for us. And I said, I would love to do that. So I branched into helping authors with editing. And I have a business partner, Larry Alexander, who has been my friend for over 30 years. We met in graduate school. And so he does the book layout for some of our clients, and he also helps with some of the editing. And here I am, about 37 years after I started writing my first book. I've now published 24 books. I've edited well over 500 books, and I've been self-employed as an editor for over 15 years.
That's amazing. Your story sounds so much like mine. I came from the publishing and advertising world, and I too delved into that. I don't know which company you used, but I used one of those big ones as well. And we didn't know back then. I don't know if you did. I didn't know until a little bit later that all of those small self-publishing companies that we were using back 2007, 8, 9, 10 were actually subsidiaries of those big companies that were rejecting all of us. Did you know that
I,
back then?
I did not. No, no. I think they're more open now that there's a lot of them. They have their traditional publishing branch, and then they have their side branch where they're clear that yes, they'll publish your book if you pay them to do it. But
Yeah.
back then, and a lot of the companies that existed back then have all bought each other up and merged into becoming one or two companies now.
Yeah, that's very true. So let's get a little bit into more about that 40%. So 40% was what it was back when we were doing this 2009, 2010. It's up to 55% now. But what was your experience going into these bookstores? Were they receptive to the self-published books? Because I feel like they're much more receptive now than they were back then.
Yeah, I would definitely say they're more receptive now. Back then, I had here in Marquette, Michigan, where I live, there were like 3 or 4 bookstores. There was an independently owned bookstore, Snowbound Books, which is still in business. There was Book World, which was a small chain bookstore here in the Great Lakes area.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a B. Dalton, which was a national bookstore. And I sold a lot of books at B. Dalton for the first 4 or 5 years until they closed down completely. And Book World, they lasted until maybe 5 or so years ago, just before the pandemic, I would say. Snowbound is still going. They're going to celebrate their 40th anniversary this year, which I'm really happy about. But they all kind of, because my books were local, they were willing to take a chance on them. They wanted to do, especially Book World, they only wanted to, I'm blanking on the word, but they wanted to pay me as the book sold rather than pay me outright for the
Consignment. Yeah.
exactly, consignment. And so I had a lot of other places also that weren't bookstores that I tried to sell my books, like the local museums, the gift shops, a lot of the different tourist places in the UP, the national parks, those sorts of places would buy some. But most of those also wanted to do consignment. And over the years, I lost a lot of books by doing consignment. Because like I would have them in a restaurant in a town, 50 miles away, and the restaurant would go out of business and never call me and say, hey, come get your books. So my books would just disappear. So now I only have maybe half a dozen places that I actually locally sell my books, but I only do that also in terms of they buy the books from me. And then if the books don't sell, that's their problem, not my problem.
Okay.
Because it was just too much to try to keep track of all the books. But now I also sell a lot of books online through, Amazon, Ingram Spark, Barnes and Noble, the different online websites. And I've found that as the years have gone by, I started out with a website and I was selling books through my website, but now I hardly ever get a sale off of my website. Maybe at Christmas I get a few, but everybody is going to the online bookstores to buy books, or they go to Snowbound here in Marquette and buy their books, and then I bring books to Snowbound to sell every once in a while.
Yeah, I think most people do. And that's why we work so hard with that, with traffic school is, if books are sold online, you need that digital presence out there to be able to sell them. And people don't realize that. It sounds like I used to do a lot of local too. I wrote fiction novels. So they took place in San Luis Obispo, LA, counties in that area. So it was easy because it was local fiction. But again, same experience. I also had the experience of, I don't know who you used, and I don't want to badmouth anybody on here, but the company I used also sold me or tried to sell me a lot of stuff that doesn't sell books. So back then they tried to sell you bookmarkers. I actually had a client, I was at her house because I started out in the senior center with my publishing company. And I was actually at her house, and a very large company called her while I was sitting there and said that they had someone interested in turning her book into a screenplay. And for $20,000, they could do that and shop it to Hollywood. And I literally looked at her and I said, how many copies did you sell? And she said 12. And I was like, and how many of those people were family? And she's like, 12. And I was like, do you really think somebody, I just thought that was such a scam to pull.
Yeah. And I still get a lot of calls, telemarketing calls from people that say, oh, we've done a study of your book and we're very interested in your book and we think it will make a wonderful best-selling film and blah, blah, blah. And I say, which book are you talking about? I have 24 of them. Half the time they can't even tell me what the title is, or they're picking a title that was like my second published book. I don't know why they're so fixated on that specific book. It's the second book in a series, and they don't even seem to realize that. You would think they'd want the first. So, these people are not in any way really ethical.
And there was so much. So it sounds like you experienced what I did back then, and we don't do that in our company with the here it's cheap to publish, but we're going to mark up the books so high on the back end that you won't be able to sell them. So they have a guaranteed, I remember I figured it out one time. Once I got in touch with Ingram and they have those calculators online, I would figure what would this cost to print at Ingram, and then I'd go back to the publisher that I used, and it was like a 50% markup. So we were making money right and left, not only on the books that they were selling authors, but if you figure that when they go into like an Amazon and you've got retail minus 50% or 55% for the distributors, and then they've marked up this book to the point where, you're getting a buck.
Right. No, my first book, they priced it because it was a long book, like 200,000 words, about 480 pages.
Wow.
This company in 2006, my first book came out. They priced it at 25.95, and to buy 100 copies, I had to pay like I think 15.65 a copy.
Oh my
And
gosh.
now I have it available through the like Ingram Spark, and it's I don't know $5 or $6 a
Yeah.
copy. And 20 years later, I mean, I've never raised the price on that book because it was just so high to start out with, and I still can print it and make a profit off of it.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy. I don't think I haven't raised the price of mine either because of course I don't have to pay, there are costs that I don't have to pay because I own the company. But very interesting how this has morphed through time with it. So let's talk a little bit about editing because I think as an editor, you probably see the stories that people tell, and then the book comes over to me and they get their first format to look through. And then they start complaining, oh, the editor took out all this stuff and I need to put it back in. And a lot of times you guys take it out because it's not critical information to the story. So talk a little bit about that and how you work and why you would take stuff like that and how putting back in can be really detrimental to that book.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on the book, if it's fiction or nonfiction. I do both. I do a lot of what are personal development books where they use a lot of personal stories to make their points. So it might be a book about overcoming your fear or, overcoming obstacles, something like that. And they have, a dozen chapters discussing different points, and they have stories included. And a lot of the stories, like you said, sometimes they're not really relevant to the point. Sometimes I'll say, can you give us more details? Can you pick a different story? I try not to delete stories from the books, but I write them comments and let them know that these things need to be revisited and rethought out. But you're right that a lot of the time when I'm ready to send, when the book is done, I always tell the author, and most of the layout people I work with prefer that I send the manuscript to them rather than the author send the manuscript to them, because I've had authors in the past who I returned their book to them and then they decide to make a bunch of changes and then they send it to the layout person and the book gets laid out with all these typos that they introduced into it, which I didn't know because I never saw the manuscript again. Also, I always tell them once it goes to the layout person, we are done. You do not want to rewrite anything. The only thing we want to change is if we find a typo. And yet they will start rewriting sentences. I've had people, do 500 corrections, rewrites, just ridiculous rewrites that are not needed, and revising whole paragraphs and even inserting new chapters, and it just becomes a nightmare for the layout person and the author and the editor in the whole process. So authors really need to understand that once the book goes to the layout person, the writing is done. If you want to come up with second edition later, fine, but at this point we don't want to rewrite anything.
Yes, that is so true. And that's what I loved about what you did because anything that once the layout was done, I assume anything that was changed was between you and the author. And I always get caught in the middle of that with, this story doesn't make sense. And when you think about it, if I tell you a story, I'm probably going to tell it in great detail. And to get the point across, you probably don't need the who, what, where, how in detail. So
Mm-hmm.
those are the types of things that you're cutting, I don't
Right,
want to say cutting from the story, but you're making the story more readable because a lot of times that can be really boring when you give
right,
so much detail.
right. For example, I have a lot of authors that say, oh, I've written this book. It's transcripts from my podcasts, and I've turned them each into a chapter. And I look at it and think, no one wants to read this
Yeah.
because it's a transcript from a podcast. It's fine to listen to the podcast, it will make sense. But when you transcribe those word for word, it's very boring to read. It's full of and ah and people writing in saying fragments because they back up and they go back to explain things. And so I go in and I rewrite all of that and make it concise and make everything chronological, because we all, when we tell stories, will say, oh, I forgot about this. And then we go back and tell something that happened, earlier than where the point we were at. So I'll move paragraphs around and those sorts of things, and just try to make the story flow and take out anything that's not relevant.
Yeah, that is so important. We're actually in the process of working on a real estate podcast anthology. And we have someone who's rewriting the transcripts from it because of that reason. And a lot of times they'll give it to you. I don't know if you've experienced this, but it's like Tyler said this and Juliet said
Mhm.
that. And it's like,
Mhm.
that is so boring.
Right, right. And a lot of the time, I'll even just take, like, if we'd made this conversation into a podcast, no offense to you, but I would probably take out, if you were asking me questions and I was giving answers, I would just take out your questions and rewrite the first sentence to be a
Yeah.
topic sentence being into the paragraph. So it reads more like an essay.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're doing with the anthology as well, because it does. I mean, you're giving tips, not transcript type information. So tell me a little bit about the fiction aspect, because we typically work with nonfiction people, but we have a few fiction authors, and there's a lot to edit out in there because I know a lot of people go from first person to third person, like they don't realize they're switching, or the show versus tell, which is so hard for people.
Right. Yeah, I tend to, no offense to the nonfiction authors, but I tend to think the fiction authors tend to be a little bit better writers because they're the ones that have aspired to being writers for, since they were kids. And the nonfiction writers are usually writing a book to either to get a point across or to support their business, something like that. So the nonfiction writers really are the fiction writers are really the ones that love words. So I really enjoy working with them but they're also a little bit more particular. They're the ones that are more likely to argue with me about keeping a certain word or changing a word.
Really?
So I think what is hard with fiction writing, the things that I do a lot of that I realize is with the dialogue, they like to use fancy dialogue tags. They like to say, she exclaimed, he blurted out, or he said quickly, or she said angrily. And I have to keep telling them, adverbs are not your friends. Leave the adverbs out. We don't need fancy words. We want to stick to said, asked, replied. Now and then, if you need it really, really need exclaimed, you can put that in. But you know what? If you use an exclamation point, it's obvious that they exclaimed. So I try to pare down the dialogue tags, make them as unnoticeable as possible, because I really firmly believe that the words the character says, it should be obvious from those words how they are said. So there's that. Another big issue, which I had myself as a writer in the beginning, is head hopping in scenes where there are two characters and we're getting both of their thoughts and we're hopping from one's head to the other head as they're having this conversation, and it just becomes very hard to follow. And sometimes it's three characters even in this scene that we're head hopping. So I try to explain that to them. Like I just did a novel recently where almost the whole book it was in third person, but the whole book was basically from the main character's perspective. And then there was another character, the man that she was interested in, but he was kind of a mysterious person. And then all of a sudden we were in his head. Like when we're about 85% of the way through the book, we start going into his head. And I said, no, you're ruining this. We want to experience the book the way the main character is experiencing the book. So we have to rewrite those scenes or take those references out. We don't want to know what his motivations are or what he's going to do, because you want to keep us in suspense about who this person is.
Right. And I used to write mystery novels. My very first one, Stephen King's first editor edited, and he actually did it. I had to print the manuscript and send it off. And then he sent it back. But what was devastating was, when you're on Word and they're making these little red marks, it's significantly less painful when you actually get 200 pages back with red, 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 talking head, red, red. It's I think it's much easier with the online that we have now. So what would you do with someone like me who I'm a sort of a sucky writer, but I'm a pretty good storyteller. Is that someone who should get involved with you early on in the editing process and actually be doing development with you?
I think that could be done, yes. I think if the author has an outline already done of where the story is going to go, I can usually help them with development. Or if they want to write a rough draft and send me that, and then I can help them with development. Sometimes I just do a manuscript evaluation where I read the manuscript and then give them feedback saying, what works, what doesn't work, what I think needs to be revised. So it can work in different stages as sort of like a coaching through the process or as editing once the manuscript is finished.
But probably this would be a third or second or third who already got that feedback from the first book, I would imagine. I actually had my third book sold over 25,000 copies. And
Right.
it was the first time that I had so many readers that I got really critical reviews back. And one of the ones that hurt my feelings so bad was, this was a great story. I would have thought she would have used someone that wasn't a monkey for an editor. And this person was already editing my next book. And I was
Wow.
horrified. That's when I found out, 4 books in, that I had a
Mhm.
really bad editor. So,
Yeah.
what kind of questions, if someone comes to you and they're a first time author, what kind of questions should they be asking in that interview process with an editor?
Well, I think probably the most important thing is that you ask the editor for an edit sample. You send your manuscript to the editor and you have them do an edit sample and you see what kinds of changes they would make. Make sure you understand why they would make those changes. And it doesn't hurt to get samples from 2 or 3 different editors
Right.
and compare them, because I've had lots of people call me up and I tell them, roughly what I estimate it would cost. And they say, oh, well, my brother's daughter, who's an English major, said she'd do it for $200. I'm like, well, you pay what you get, you
You
get what you
too.
pay for,
Yes.
and she may be the best editor in the world for all that I know, but you don't know that unless you get an edit sample and you compare it to another one. I have had lots of authors who thought their books were already edited. They came to me, said that they just needed proofreading. And I mean, really, they needed every sentence rewritten because the editor just didn't know how to edit a book. And just because someone is an English major, that doesn't mean that they are an editor.
Right.
They might be a great writer. They might know a lot about literature. They might know a lot about writing, but they may not necessarily be a good editor and be able to see words that need to be taken out, words that don't really fit, or just excess stuff. A lot of what I do is really chopping out unnecessary words. I'll take a 15 sentence and turn it into a 10-word sentence so it'll flow better.
Yeah, I love that. I get that a lot too with well, my Aunt Edna was an English school teacher, school teacher, she
Mhm.
taught English, and it's not the same thing on there. So, and I
Right.
think you really need that 2 to 3 samples as well to see if the editor is actually going to honor your voice, because if you lose your voice in the
Mhm.
process,
Yes.
yeah, it's kind of ugly too. So
Right.
we actually had a book. It was the same book that the person called and wanted to do the manuscript. She submitted to an editor, and she's English, Cockney, I think it is. So
Okay.
she speaks very, like, her book is written very differently than standard English.
Mhm.
And she did not resubmit, and she ended up with a book that didn't sound like her characters the way they should. So it is very important. So Tyler, if we want to talk to you more about how to work with you and what to do, where can we find you? And could you share where we can find that newsletter you put out? You put it out quarterly, don't you?
Yes. Yeah. I do usually 4, maybe sometimes 5 times a year. I send out a newsletter, and it usually includes about half a dozen of the books that I've edited. I write little reviews for them and share them with people, so my clients get some, a little marketing included in their package. And I also share things about my own books coming out and different events that I'm going to do. So my website is superiorbookproductions.com. I live right by Lake Superior, hence the name. So superiorbookproductions.com. And if you go to my website there, you can sign up for the newsletter. You can look at there's a few author interviews there I used to do, written interviews. There's a ton of book reviews of books that I have edited. Almost all the reviews are books I've edited. Every once in a while, someone wants a book review, but mostly they're books I've edited for people. So you can see the kinds of different genres I've done, everything from biographies and history books to mysteries and romance novels. And there's also information there about the whole editing process, the book layout process, some sort of guidelines to basic costs. And of course, if you want us to edit your book, you submit the manuscript to me, and then I will do an edit sample for you and give you a firm quote once I've seen the manuscript.
That's great. Fantastic. All right, you guys. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you for coming on the show. And if you haven't seen the magazine for May, Tyler has written an article about editing for the magazine as well. So Breakthrough Author Magazine, you can get that free subscription at breakthroughauthormagazine.com. So thank you so much for sharing today.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.